Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session of the UK Trade and Business Commission. This morning, we're covering the extremely important topic of the relationship between the devolved governments and Westminster. We hope to hear about how that relationship has evolved over the last 5 years, how the various settlements are being affected by our new trading relationships, and how effective the relationship between Westminster and the governments is being in terms of negotiating and determining the basis of further new trading relationships. And hopefully from all of that, we'll be able to draw out some suggestions for improvements and enhancements in the next phase. We're extremely grateful to our three witnesses in the first session, from the Welsh and Scottish governments and from the Institute of Government. And I would like to ask each witness to briefly introduce themselves before we get going with the first question. Ivan, could I start with you?
Indeed you can. I'll just come off mute. Thank you very much for the invitation this morning. My name is Ivan McKean. I'm the Scottish Government Minister for Business, Trade, Tourism and Enterprise.
Vaughan, would you like to go?
My name is Vaughan Gething. I'm the Welsh Government Cabinet Minister for the Economy.
And Jessica.
Great. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Jess Sargent. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute for Government, specialising in devolution and Brexit.
Thank you very much. Let me put the first question, and just as a reminder to our witnesses, we have 7 minutes allocated for each question, and I'll endeavour to keep us all to time. I'd like to ask if we could perhaps put some of the context together about how the Westminster and the devolved governments have worked together over Brexit and new trading relationships. What sort of infrastructure for consultation and debate has been created?
Well, perhaps if I start, because over Brexit, I was in a different ministerial role. I was the health minister. And so in all the iterations of getting ready for both no deal preparations and then the reality of what did happen, we had a varying experience because there were essentially different iterations of the UK government in that time. There was lots of engagement around getting ready for the health and care consequences of Brexit, getting ready for the potential challenge of pharmaceutical supply and more. So there was quite a lot of very practical conversation, but it did differ slightly between different departments. There's unevenness within the UK government about each department's willingness to engage with devolved governments. We did have engagement, but that doesn't mean to say that we'd be content with the end result about the situation that was reached. And of course, the end position we find ourselves in went through Parliament in less than a day. On trade, whilst I think there was lots and lots of engagement, and in particular very practical engagement on some things in the lead up to Brexit, but not all, we have good relationships between officials. But again, I think it's characterised by a lack of information about positions before they're reached on a UK point of view. So the UK negotiating positions on trade, there is some engagement where there's a recognition that issues are clearly devolved. There isn't really adequate engagement on issues that are reserved but plainly impact on devolved responsibilities as well. And that's one of the things we're looking to resolve. We've asked for the development of a Concord Act properly with the Department for International Trade so we can see reserved positions and contribute to them, because there is almost always going to be a devolved impact.
Yeah, I'll come in and just comment on that question. And very much I agree with much of what Vaughan said. I suppose from the outset, it's worth restating the Scottish Government's position that we think Brexit is a mistake. We think it shouldn't have happened. We think it should be reversed. And we are suffering extremely severe consequences as a consequence of the actions that the UK government has taken. However, we did seek to engage constructively through the process, recognising the result of the 2016 referendum. We published papers on how we saw that the best process and the best approach to take forward the UK's exit from the European Union might be best managed, and the role of devolved administrations in that process. And to be perfectly honest with you, the UK government frankly completely ignored our position and our input on how that should be taken forward. I would echo Vaughan's point about the UK government. It's difficult to treat it as a single entity. Different departments have different ways of looking at things, different approaches, different styles. Frankly, don't always agree with each other. Very often don't agree with each other, and very often also don't even talk to each other. So that makes it difficult to give an overarching answer there. With regard to trade, again, we've been very clear and published a paper on this some 2 years ago now, that the role of the devolved administration and that interaction with the UK government on free trade deals was hugely important, and we offered a structure and processes for that to be managed. Again, that hasn't been engaged in seriously by the UK government, and as Vaughan indicated, the Concordat would have been at least a step in the right direction in terms of understanding how we dealt with devolved issues as impacted by trade in a constructive way, but the UK government hasn't taken that forward either. So we do have meetings with UK government ministers and at official level. The amount of information that can be shared at official level is limited, and at ministerial level, while we make have some constructive discussions, in large part because of the absence of structures, it's been difficult to have a meaningful engagement at that level.
If I may just briefly before Jeff comes in, there is, you'll probably find a consistent theme as to what's said about different departments behaving differently. There is a challenge in whether we have structures that help us to engage, as well as a cultural change in personal behaviour, because actually Greg Hands, a previous trade minister, was always very decent in our conversation. So actually there wasn't a personal difficulty there at all, but the difficulty is that if intergovernmental relationships only rely on good personal relationships, then actually there's an obvious risk for challenge and difficulty in the future.
I would absolutely echo those comments from Vaughan.
Thank you both. Jessica, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Just to kind of say something a little bit about structures, obviously over the Brexit process, there was the JMC-EN, so the Joint Ministerial Council for European Negotiations, that was established. Although perhaps that didn't serve the function in terms of coming to an agreed negotiating position that perhaps it was intended to initially, there has been some really good work that's happened through that forum, particularly around kind of common frameworks and no deal planning and such like. But obviously, as the European negotiations have come to an end, there's a question of what replaces that. And actually a lot of the other intergovernmental machinery at the moment is not fully functional. For example, the plenary JMC, in which the First Ministers and the Prime Minister are meant to meet, isn't meeting at the moment. So there's a big question about this gap. There's ongoing work between the four governments through the review of intergovernmental relations. We saw a progress report published in March, and that includes things like an interministerial forum on trade, which could to some extent formalise these relationships that, as both ministers have pointed out, at the moment are slightly problematic because they rely so much on kind of individual personalities and individual will. So I know we'll come on later to some of the solutions here, but I think one of the solutions here is to formalise those arrangements and to make progress on the intergovernmental review.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I think that paints a rather gloomy picture at the beginning of the session, but hopefully we'll identify some positive themes to draw attention to later on. I'm now going to ask Liz. We slightly rejigged the order here because one of us wasn't able to attend at the last minute. Liz is going to put two questions now. Liz.
Thank you very much, Peter. Diolch yn fawr I chi gyd am ddod, Ivan and Peter and Jess. I'm going to ask these questions in an order, please. If I could ask Ivan the first, and then Vaughan to you, and then to Jess. You've all of you mentioned the need to formalise relations, and I think what I'd like to go under the skin of that some more, and a sense of what actually, in terms of resources, do you require to formalise those relations? Obviously, there's the will as well, but do you feel, and particularly to the Scottish Government and then to Welsh Government, that as things stand, you have the resources within your within your present capacity to deal as things stand at the moment? And then if it is to be formalised, what would you require in terms of resources there? So Ivan, if I could go to you first, please.
Yeah, in terms of resources, we've worked hard to put in place our Directorate of International Trade and Investment over the last 3 years. I was the first Scottish Government Minister to have trade in my title, and that was in 2018. And we've built up resource within Scottish Government to be able to address those issues, both in terms of the practicalities. For example, our export plan, our inward investment plan, our global capital investment plan that we've published over the past 2 years, but also in terms of broader trade policy issues and our vision for trade that we published earlier this year. That's had, I have to say, very positive feedback across the whole of the UK and beyond. And to give us the capacity to be able to engage and publish or present to UK government Scottish perspective on sectoral impacts and broader impacts of trade deals, for example, with Australia, New Zealand and so on, and we continue to engage with that information. So to answer your question, we've put in place a directorate to deal with that. We continue to grow and expand that, I think more of the challenge isn't so much that, it's about getting information cooperation back from UK government that allows us to efficiently address those questions is probably more of a challenge than resources.
Thank you, Ivan. And Vaughan, to what degree has Welsh Government been able to put similar arrangements in place, and what would be the ideal arrangements?
If you think about leaving the European Union, we had quite a range of papers, you'll recall, that we published on potential impacts and the different models for leaving as well. So we did marshal lots of resources, lots of ministerial time, as well as officials to draw people in. Now, leaving the European Union is a fact, and it's actually a part of standard business, but that does provide different challenges together with trade, because we probably don't have the same resources that the UK government does have in terms of the physical resources available to it, not just money. I do think we're right about this point about structures, because there are often good relations between officials, but it's then the ability to have influence within those as well. And I think the structure to allow us to have earlier engagement would allow us to prioritise where the greatest gain is made, not just from our point of view, but from a UK one as well. And if you think about the ongoing reality of our relationship with Europe, the TCA is a framework. There's lots of detail to fill in, and there are detailed meetings that are taking place. Now, if we were to have Welsh Government represented in every single strand of those, that might be rather challenging and stretching. But actually, if we understood more clearly the direct impact of those, we could be upfront about the areas that mattered most to us. And one area where we're not taking part, for example, is in discussions around the Northern Ireland Protocol, where actually what happens there has a direct impact on trade and the economy in Wales. I'm sure it does in Scotland as well. So it's the ability to have a conversation. And in honesty, we have been constructive and trusted interlocutors in this. You won't find that the Welsh Government has leaked information that we've been provided with, because actually we want to get on and do something that's of value. And I think it is both the cultural part of investing in some trust and having structures allow us to do that. Because I think if we tried to say we just need more money, that gets us into a conversation that takes us away from getting the relationships right, which is actually more important.
Yeah. I think we'll be touching on the money, and I think the things you said in the past about the Shared Prosperity Fund as well. But I'd be very interested if you could come back a little more to formalise what you were saying about a concordat. What would the ideal shape of that be?
Well, we've actually made proposals as well. So there has been some work taken forward on this, but there's been a view from the Department for International Trade, because relationships are good, there's no need for a concordat. And that goes back to our point about wanting to have something that doesn't rely on personal relationships. And it comes up the points Ivan and myself have made about formalising that where areas are devolved, about how early that information is provided, but also about before issues are published, we then understand what the likely position is on reserve matters, so we can input into where those matters directly affect devolved responsibilities. Because there have been times we've learned about things very late in the day, if not at the point of publication. And a concordat that sets out when we would share information and how we do that, how we input into that, I think would clarify how we all want to behave in an area that just takes away the personal element of it, that I think would help all of us, including the UK government.
Yes, well, of course. I mean, the personal arrangement, we're just showing we're moving from day to day under the present arrangements, and it's not structurally there in place. There's no structure in place to acknowledge the new position. Thank you very much, Vaughan. I'll be back to you in a moment on something, but if I could turn to Jess from a view from the Institute of Government about the resources available to the devolved government.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, I mean, it's no secret that the devolved administrations are smaller than the UK government. They don't have the same capacity, particularly in an area like trade. And I think one of the important things is talking about what Vaughan was talking about there, about trust. And I think Brexit has meant that perhaps there is slightly less cooperation in kind of sharing information and intelligence and analysis than perhaps there should be. And while I think it's very important where the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales have distinct interests in trade negotiations where their economies might be slightly different, that they're able to kind of conduct that analysis and present that to the UK government. In many areas, all parts of the UK will have very common interests when we're talking about negotiating with an international partner. So I think it's important that resources are pooled in some way or shared between the UK government and the devolved administration so they can all make use of that work that's being done and we don't end up duplicating that resources. But, as Vaughan mentioned there, I think a very important part of being able to do that is kind of rebuilding trust and changing the mindset of officials in some way, in that, there is a common interest in when the UK as a whole is negotiating with international trading partners rather than kind of tensions within and between the different governments.
Thank you very much indeed. And I will move on to what you probably have in your list as question 4. And if I could turn to Vaughan first of all, but my particular question in relation to the impact of Brexit on the devolution framework, there's a particular point with Welsh Government in that Welsh Government, I know, submitted a request for a judicial review of the Internal Market Act back at the beginning of this year. That at the time was turned down as being premature, but it's now been resubmitted successfully. Vaughan, could you tell us some more about why this application was made in relation to the Internal Market Act? And I'd also be very grateful if you could touch on the Subsidy Control Bill, which of course is one of the manifestations now of how the Internal Market Act is going to play out.
Well, we think the Internal Market Act is heavy-handed and has a very real potential to undermine 20 years of settled will on devolution. We've already seen that it allows UK ministers to reach into devolved areas to spend and make alternative choices. And actually, that's really unhelpful from a business point of view to have two governments competing in exactly the same space. We could get drawn into a long and unhelpful constitutional argument where powers lie. And after all, the powers that we have been settled after 2 referenda here in Wales as well. And I think it's really unproductive. We do recognise that there is a need to have some idea about what a UK internal market means, but it can't simply be the one partner decides the lowest common denominator and everyone else has to act in that way. And I'm afraid that's a bit of the structure of the Internal Market Act, as well as the ability to take the powers to essentially try to override devolved decision making. The same with the Subsidy Control Bill. We think that we recognise there should be a framework for subsidy control within the UK as well. But again, it does seem that lots of the power, the ultimate arbiter, ends up being a UK minister. And that in itself is obviously going to be fraught with difficulty and challenge in the future. So the Court of Appeal are going to look at the challenge the Welsh Government has provided. They've indicated they think that there are generally important issues about the devolution settlement, how governments interact with people. I do think, though, that it's not just about goodwill between ministers, but a need to look seriously at how the governments are going to behave, whether we're going to have an era where the UK government says, well, we don't like what you're doing, we'll decide for you. I think that is the wrong way to go about the future of the union. I think it's actually a really awful environment for other decision makers, not just businesses. So I hope that the work on intergovernmental relations can be concluded, because that should show that there is a way for us to behave differently. And there will include potential later questions on common frameworks as well. So it isn't like there isn't an alternative way to resolve some of these challenges.
Could you just give me some indication of what do you think that Welsh Government might want to do, which this possible intervention on the part of the UK government might actually stymie or even prevent?
Well, look, on subsidy control, we need to have a clear framework where we understand how it can support businesses, in particular those areas where there's a case where you need to stimulate economic activity. Broadly, if you think about your knowledge of Wales, the M4 corridor and below. Actually, it's easier to stimulate economic activity in the heads of the valleys or potentially in rural parts of Wales. So we need to understand the framework for subsidy control to know what we can do and not get drawn into disputes. You think about some of my old areas of responsibility in my former life. If we wanted to introduce labelling for public health reasons, for products, whether alcohol-related foods or otherwise, potentially we could end up in a position where we couldn't do that. And if you import goods into one part of the UK, then they're supposedly then allowed to go on and not have a different way of being presented in different parts of the UK too. Now, the problem there is that if they're imported into England with different labelling requirements, different health information, then potentially our ability to regulate within our devolved competencies could be overridden. And those are real examples that could take place. There are many others, and I think we sent these to colleagues in Parliament in the past when the internal market was going through.
Lovely, thank you very much, Vaughan. And Ivan, I know that the devolution settlement for Scotland is quite considerably different to that of Wales. But could you illustrate ways in which the new framework may actually impact on your freedom to govern Scotland in the way that you would see best?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just to echo much of what Vaughan has said, the Internal Market Act we see is deeply problematic and effectively attempting to roll back the powers of devolution, and rather than approaching this in a consensual basis where we could all sit down and agree on frameworks and approaches that works for everyone, it's very much about the UK government taking the opportunity of Brexit to challenge the devolved governments with regards to the power, where that power lies. So we do see that as deeply problematic, and the breaches of the Sewell Convention, the constitutional rule that the UK Parliament obviously wouldn't pass laws in devolved matters without the consent of devolved parliaments, is something that has been breached and undermined at various junctures as well. So we've seen that unfold over the past years as we've moved through the Brexit process. So that's concerning, and as Vaughan said, there's examples across many of the devolved responsibilities, be it labelling was mentioned, in health, environment, and many others, where we can see that there are aspects which impinge on international trade and other areas where the frameworks would allow there to be agreement across the UK, where in the situation we're in, the UK government going ahead on its own without that agreement is problematic and impinges on the devolved areas that are devolved. So in general, we think there's very much scope for us to have a common approach here through frameworks, and that's something we support. But the approach to the internal market bill has been hugely difficult in that regard, in the way that the UK government has approached that, very heavy-handed, and makes it difficult for us to operate in the way that we think we should. In regard to subs control, again, clarity there is hugely important, as has been said by Vaughan, so that we understand what we can and can't do. And I've got several situations coming across my desk at the moment where we need to understand what the scope of the ability of the Scottish Government to support industrial development in Scotland is, and where we could potentially bump up against the issues with regards to subsidy control. So clarity on that is very important. And again, from our perspective, maintaining alignment as much as possible with the EU with an eye to reaccession is something that we do take on board as part of these considerations as well.
Lovely. Thank you. Sorry, Jess, I think I better hand over back to the chair now for time, but those were very useful answers. Thank you very much indeed, Ivan and Vaughan.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Paul, would you like to put your question about the history of the negotiations over the last 5 years?
Thank you very much indeed, and thank the panel for their answers thus far. But in doing so, do you think that during the past 5 years that the UK government has welcomed the involvement of the devolved administrations in the Brexit and trade questions? And I'm just prefacing this with the fact that, you know, Northern Ireland, and it has been mentioned, we have the protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol in place, which has inhibited trade even within the United Kingdom and between different regions. So we're getting a double whammy in Northern Ireland in respect to what's been happening. And we do think that the government have been tone deaf in relation to the questions that we were putting forward prior to what we ended up with in January of this year, being imposed upon us. Just I'd ask that probably first to Ivan.
Yeah, sure. I think welcome is a very big word in this context. I would say it was very far from welcoming. It's been, and not just my own brief, but right across all engagement between Scottish Government and Scottish Government ministers and the UK Government. It's very often been a question of having to elbow our way into conversations and find opportunities to make our points heard and get those points across. So the UK Government has approached this very much, frankly, I would say, with regard to, I would say they view the devolved administrations as more of a nuisance that has to be dealt with than something that's that them seeing value in having us as part of the process. I think that's unfortunate, and I think if you look across other subnational governments in other countries around the world, they've got much more developed mechanisms and processes for that engagement at a subnational level, and we can look at Canada, Australia, or Belgium. There's plenty of examples where there's a much more structured approach to that and much more meaningful engagement. So I find it unfortunate that the UK Government has taken that approach, which really has been fairly grudging and not much more than a tick box exercise. And I think it's the same with regard to the trade agreement negotiations outside of the EU. We've been very clear about a constructive approach modelled on some of those other international examples, you know, of dealing with this at a subnational level that we think adds value, not just to us, not just to the UK, but also to the trading partners, because it gives them the confidence that across a whole range of reserved and devolved matters, when the trade deal is agreed and will be implemented right across the country, and they're not going to hit wrinkles or problems or challenges because they're impinging on devolved areas as a consequence of those agreements. So we think it's important, and I think it's unfortunate the UK Government hasn't taken seriously our representations in this regard.
And probably the same question to Vaughan, but you know, on the back of what has been said, we believe that some of the outworkings of what we've ended up with has potentially put the devolution settlement that we have in Northern Ireland in jeopardy, and that's a point that needs to maybe be highlighted, but that's by the by. Vaughan?
But I think it's pretty clear that the UK government have always welcomed our involvement in both Brexit and the negotiations, and indeed all of the issues around international trade. But like I said, going back to my first answer, it depends which department you're working with, because there were real practical cooperation that was real. I had a number of meetings with health ministers. It got off to a bumpy start, but actually by the second and third iteration of no deal preparation, there was a clear understanding of the level of risk that was shared across the UK if we left on those terms. And, you know, my former First Minister, Carwyn Jones, regularly talked about issues on the island of Ireland, the soft or the hard border, and what that meant in terms of relations with the rest of the UK and our relations with customs, union and single market. So the issues were known. And actually the difficulty, I think, has been that our engagement hasn't not just been not necessarily welcome, but not listened to in terms of trying to engage to what the ultimate answer is. And, you know, UK parliamentarians passed the agreement, and they agreed to pass the agreement in less than a day. So we're fixed with what came from the 2019 election and what the UK Parliament then decided to do in very short order. Now, I think the issue then is, what can we do to make the position work? And that's why we want to be engaged in the TCA negotiations, and actually my officials are engaged in a range of those. But I do think that some greater honesty and clarity about the wide range of those consequences is really important. Because when we talk about trade, it's not just new trade deals with other parts of the world, but of course it's our ongoing trading relationships with our nearest trading partners. So I think about Welsh ports, and I have a great deal of interest in what happens on the island of Ireland, as well as the trade that would flow through on the former land bridge when it was much easier. So there is real direct interest, and we want to try to find a constructive way through, but it does require some honesty about the choices that are available to us. And I do think that if we make real progress on finalising the intergovernmental framework and in finalising some of the common frameworks, we could have much greater clarity, not just for ministers and officials in governments, but actually for people we represent, whether you're in a business or a normal citizen trying to understand what your ability to move around and work in different parts of the UK and Europe is.
Jessica, maybe in your role as a senior researcher in this field, could you maybe give us your opinion?
Yeah, from the outside, I think one of the things I pick up there is the questions about kind of over the past 5 years. And I think Vaughan's right that there is differences within government, but I think there's also been differences between different governments, between the Theresa May administration and the Boris Johnson administration. And that's not to pretend that under Theresa May involvement was always perfect. And I think the commitment she made early on to have a kind of joint position on Brexit was never realised. But things like common frameworks were established. As Vaughan said, there was some good planning around no deal. In fact, there was the unusual step in which devolved ministers were invited to UK cabinet committees, which hasn't happened since. But I think since the Boris Johnson administration came in, we did see, even over no deal, some of that joint working slightly falter. And obviously since then we had the agreement of the withdrawal agreement and the TCA without the agreement of the devolved administration. So I think there has been a journey over time. I would draw a bit of a distinction here between negotiations on Brexit and international trade. I think on Brexit, it was very clear that all the governments had essentially mutually incompatible political positions, that there's kind of very little way to reconcile the UK government's desire for this complete regulatory autonomy and the Welsh and Scottish government's desire for a kind of closer relationship with Europe. On international trade, I think there is more space for common interests and kind of a joint negotiating position. It's interesting to hear that the ministers don't think that we're perhaps making as much progress to that as we could do. But I think politically, there is more potential for better working on international trade than there has been on Brexit. So hopefully there's a bit more of a positive note there.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Paul. Hilary, would you like to take the next question?
Thank you, Peter, very much indeed. I want to ask about common frameworks because they are being sought as a way of trying to sort this out and agree, as the name suggests, a common approach, which will help when it comes to trade relations with other countries. And as you said, Ivan, there are lots of other countries in the world that have grappled with this because they've got devolved systems of government. So my question, perhaps if I could start with you, Ivan, is how are the discussions on the common frameworks going?
They're ongoing.
Yep.
We're working to finalise those, but I think the Internal Market Act makes that more difficult. A number of levels in terms of the message it sends, that the UK government considers itself in a position to be able to move forward without the consent of devolved administrations. That sets an unhelpful tone. It's clearly incompatible with the devolution settlement, and to our mind, it's opened the door to a race to the bottom on a whole range of aspects across food standards, environmental standards, and so on and so forth. So that context, the backdrop is unhelpful. And of course, what it also means is that it probably removes an incentive to manage policy divergence by agreement, because it puts the UK government in a position where it doesn't have to. So that backdrop in that context is frankly unhelpful with regards to moving forward with common frameworks. But we do continue to engage at that level and move forward where we can.
Okay, Vaughan.
Yes, so there is progress being made here. There was ministers from different governments met earlier this month, and the plan is to be able to publish an update on the work on frameworks for scrutiny, because we're going to have our own legislators who want to see what's being done. There'll be great interest there as well. So I'm hopeful that in the coming weeks we'll be able to publish something more for scrutiny. I know this commission will take an interest in that too. And I think what that does show is it does show there is an alternative to simply turning up and saying there is one decision maker and everyone else has to do what they're told. That guarantees conflict, whereas a common framework and the intergovernmental relations review that should go alongside it, if they're implemented and make progress, it will show there's a way to be clear about how to resolve issues, how to avoid issues being a dispute in the first place, clarity and dispute resolution frameworks with the intergovernmental relations built on some common frameworks as what we're all thinking that we can do together. Now, I think that's a much better place for us to be. So you have this sort of odd relationship. On the one track, there's something that looks a lot more like you just need to do what you're told. And on the other hand, there's work going on that says, actually, this is how we can work together. And it'd be really interesting to see in practical terms how Michael Gove's new responsibilities for the union, including intergovernmental relations, that means we will now see agreement, because I think there'll be a definite and a positive step forward. I'd much rather spend my time investing in how we make those things work rather than having an argument about why they haven't happened.
And if you are able to reach agreement on all of the common frameworks that have been identified, then that would render the powers which hanging over the discussions that Ivan and you referred to in effect obsolete.
Well, it would be a way of resolving those potentially, because there is an intersection with the Internal Market Act.
Yeah.
Now, what we'd like to have is some frameworks actually that's an answer, and you don't need to go over here to use these heavy-handed powers that exist alternatively. And the difficulty is that as long as those powers are there, then that is just a problem. And again, you're reliant on the personal relationships and whether individual ministers or the Prime Minister decide, I don't want to go down the published framework of how we'll do things. I will use the legal powers that exist in the Internal Market Act. So it will be a helpful way to show that you don't have to go down a much more confrontational approach. I think that isn't necessarily the best way to conduct business internationally, let alone within the 4 nations of the UK.
Okay. And Jess, what's your view of how it's going?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what has been said. I think common frameworks are to some extent the answer to some of the problems raised by the UK Internal Market Act. Ivan mentioned the question about race to the bottom. That can obviously be countered if all 4 governments agree to jointly raise standards. And while that might sound a bit naive, we have had things like the 4 governments agree to include folic acid in bread on a UK-wide basis. So there is the potential there. I mean, one other thing just to mention about the interaction between common frameworks and the UK Internal Market Act is that the Act does have a power to add new exclusions to what's called the market access principles. I think mutual recognition being the most important one here, which would allow any goods that meet, for example, English standards to be sold in Scotland. So that exclusion can be added by the UK government, including on the basis of an agreement through a common frameworks process. And I think this is an opportunity for all 4 governments to look at policies on a kind of case-by-case basis and ensure that the terms of the UK Internal Market Act don't prevent the devolved administrations from pursuing legitimate policy aims. So, for example, an example that's often given is around kind of single-use plastics, that if there was a ban on single-use plastics in Wales, that ban wouldn't be effective against single-use plastics produced in England, which could still be sold in Wales. That's an example where all 4 governments could come and look together and look at the evidence and consider whether that ban would actually be detrimental to the UK internal market, or whether actually the kind of policy logic behind it, the kind of environmental objective behind it is stronger than the potential kind of barrier to trade that might create. Okay. And then they could agree to add a new exclusion. So I think there are ways in which we could make this framework more palatable and kind of work on a more cooperative basis.
Thank you. And just finally, and very, very quickly to Ivan and to Vaughan, could you just identify the areas that are being discussed under the Common Frameworks arrangement where you think there will be most difficulty in reaching agreement? What are the issues? Ivan?
I mean, it's an evolving landscape and there are many different moving parts to this. So I'm not in a position to be able to point to specifics at the moment. I would say that, I think there's progress being made across a range of them, but I wouldn't be able to point to any specifics in that regard at this time.
No, that's fine. Okay, and finally, Vaughan.
Well, I'd say that probably the most significant area is the one we've just covered, the exclusions in the Internal Market Act. Right. Because there's policy choices here. And of course, you know, in the area that's just been highlighted, we've used this before, that Jessica's highlighted too, a ban on single-use plastics, plainly within our devolved powers to do so. Internal Market Act could prevent us from going there, despite that it's within our devolved powers. And it's a clear manifesto pledge that people in Wales voted on just a few months ago. And that has real potential, quite ugly conflict that goes beyond what happens with the Internal Market Act. So agreeing on those exclusions, how common frameworks could actually make sense of that, I think would be really important. And I think that will mean that if we can do that, there should be progress on other issues like international trade and the protocol and what happens with the TCA as well. Okay, that is really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Peter.
Thank you very much, Hilary. We now turn to Dr. Whitford to ask a question on the Shared Prosperity Fund.
Thanks very much. Obviously, we've just touched on how the UK government can reach into devolved competencies such as environment or public health measures like Scotland's minimum unit pricing of alcohol through the Internal Market Act. But another big issue is the loss of EU funding, which was under the strategic control of the devolved governments, but is likely to be replaced by a more centralised shared prosperity fund. So starting with yourself, Ivan, could I ask what your experience of the Levelling Up Fund, which appears to be a forerunner, whether that's given you reassurance or concern? Do you think the devolved governments are going to have sufficient input? And do you think the funds are actually likely to be a sufficient replacement for what we're losing in EU funding?
Yeah, and I had portfolio responsibility for this area up until to May of this year, so I've been very closely involved with the development or the lack of development of it over the previous 2 or 3 years, and it was a deeply frustrating process. It became increasingly clear that not only did and this goes back to the comments we made earlier, the UK government itself within the various different departments didn't have agreement or coherence or alignment in what they were trying to achieve here or how they were going to do it. So we worked with a group of stakeholders. We spent quite considerable time developing and publishing how we saw the Shared Prosperity Fund would best work in a Scottish context as a replacement for EU funds, which, as you rightly said, were under the control controlled within the Scottish context entirely. So we were able to allocate those and align them with other policy initiatives, be it on economic development or regional inclusion or other aspects of what was happening across the Scottish policy landscape. So that was all lost. We published the output from that group. We pulled together that expert group, and frankly, that hasn't been taken on board by UK government at all. They've gone off on a very difficult to understand direction. They've allocated different parts of Scotland as different priorities for consideration under Shared Prosperity and Levelling Up Fund, which we struggled to understand how they came to those conclusions. Some cynics have suggested it's got more to do with marginal seats than anything else, but I wouldn't want to comment on that. So it's been difficult to understand. Local government has found it hugely frustrating in Scotland because of the lack of clarity, lack of alignment, lack of sense of where this is going and why, and it's been a difficult experience. And at the end of the day, if you look at the huge value that Scotland derived from EU structural funds over previous decades, and you look at the potential disruption to much of that activity, it really hits communities, individuals and businesses at all levels and across Scotland, and we find that concerning as well.
Obviously, the Levelling Up Fund itself, as in money, is relatively limited. Does the Scottish Government have any idea as yet what scale the Shared Prosperity Fund would be? Is it likely to replace in scale the EU funding, do you think?
No, we did some work on what those funds would have to look like to replace EU funds in their entirety that come to Scotland, and how that would have looked in the next 7-year EU period, and published that information as part of our analysis. And the funds that we're looking at, as been indicated by UK government, fall short of that, far short of that. So in terms of quantum, as well as in terms of clarity of policy alignment, it's far short of what we benefited from under the EU programmes.
Thanks very much. Coming to yourself, Vaughan, obviously, as Ivan touched on, the areas that were highlighted, under the EU, Highlands and Islands was always given a significant priority, but is not under Levelling Up Fund. Have you had the same experience in Wales of the areas that are highlighted as priority not matching what you would have expected?
Yes, we have. And I'd say the challenges with the replacement funds are both about the promises about no funds being lost, when as a matter of fact, in this pilot phase, funds absolutely have been lost. We would expect we're still within the European Union to have £375 million available to us this year. In the pilot phase, we think we'll get nearer £10 million. So in the first year, it's a matter of fact, not opinion, there will be less money available. Then the structure of the funds, both how those areas are included and excluded as priority areas, it just isn't clear to us how that's been done. And I know there have been talks about there was a methodology, it's never been shared with us or published. But it is then more than that. The structure of how the pilot phase is being run with the local authority-led bidding process is causing real angst and unhappiness within local government, and local government of every political leadership. Independent, Plaid Cymru, Conservative-led and Welsh Labour-led authorities are struggling with the way that the bids have been structured. So local authorities had to get their bids in very quickly. 6 months left of this financial year to spend the money, and decisions haven't been made. So the time frame for decision making. But more than that, because it's a competitive bidding process, that doesn't guarantee that areas of greatest need will actually get the monies. So you could have people able to write better bids, acquiring more funds from the central pot, and that means areas of need will lose out. Also, because it's local authority led, it doesn't allow you to have regional and strategic approaches. So, for example, we fund a third of our apprenticeship programme in Wales came from former European funds. Now, I think anyone on any side in politics wants to have a structure that potentially capsizes a third of our apprentices. And, every party is competing to say how much they want apprenticeships for the future rather than to reduce the size of them. And that's the same for a range of other areas where regional and national strategic approaches aren't possible with the current pilot phase. But there is also a structural problem for the UK government as well, because there was a previous European Union framework. And within that, then, there were choices made at local or regional levels. And Welsh ministers made those choices in Wales for 20 years. Now, at the moment, it looks as if the one decision that was made was that Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish governments couldn't undertake that same role, and decisions would be made by UK ministers. Actually, if you're running a local authority bidded process across the UK, you need an awful lot of capacity within a UK department to centrally manage that, not to make choices, but to manage the detail of that. So actually, I don't think it's a practical way of managing the process for the future. Future funds may get up to the level that we would otherwise have had if we were still part of the European Union structure. But there is an opportunity for Michael Gove to reset the clock, because it isn't a secret that he hasn't got a plan he's inherited from Robert Jenrick. There just isn't really a plan, and that's the same in any part of the UK. So there's an opportunity to do something much more sensible here and work with the grain of devolved governments, rather than having what I think is a needless fight where there just isn't the capacity to deliver on the previous approach.
Coming to yourself, Jess, I mean, as well as undermining, if you like, the devolution strategic input, do you think that there's going to be a lot of wasted effort in local governments preparing these bids, particularly at high speed, which will require a lot of resources, and then maybe not being successful, that this may actually be quite a wasteful approach and also quite difficult for the UK government to run, as Vaughan was suggesting?
Absolutely, I think it will put pressure on kind of local government, and as Vaughan was saying, I think also there's a question of how this works in central government in the UK, and particularly the department, which has obviously now changed name now that Michael Gove has gone there. It was traditionally a very kind of English department that looked at things like housing and English local government, so didn't really have the understanding of devolution to be able to administer this scheme on a UK-wide basis. With the appointment of Michael Gove, perhaps that might change. But I think the other thing I would also mention, I know this session is focused on Scotland and Wales, but there are some real questions about how the scheme will be allocated in Northern Ireland. There is a different approach being taken there, where there is less involvement from local authorities and even more centralisation in how those decisions are made. There are also particular considerations to be taken there in ensuring that money is distributed on a kind of cross-community basis and in a fair way. The Northern Ireland Executive has a huge amount of experience of administering funds in that way. The UK government a lot less so. So I think I hope that lessons will be learned from this pilot scheme that will help to iron out some of those issues, and potentially a greater role is given to all of the devolved administrations to ensure that the objectives of the schemes and the objectives of the devolved administrations and local government are all joined up to make sure the money is spent most effectively.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we must move on. Tamara, please.
Thank you, Chair. So my question, which I'm going to pose to all of you, is in many countries, there is a tension between the ability of devolved governments to set their own regulations and the requirements of international trade. How do you think that could be best managed? And do you think the UK government has the right balance? And please, when you answer, could you give examples? And I'm going to start with you, Jess, please.
Thanks. I think there are two aspects to this question, really. The first is how kind of states with sub-regional governments manage their internal markets, and we've discussed a bit now recently about how what the proposals the UK government has put in place. There are various options. You can have something like harmonisation of rules, like we have in the EU, this kind of mutual recognition that we have in the UK now, alongside non-discrimination, which basically prevents kind of sub-regional governments from discriminating against each other. It's worth noting that some places like the US have a lot less in place to ensure that there are that trade can move freely, that there's a lot more regulatory autonomy for individual states, though that does mean trade barriers. So there is this kind of trade-off here between regulatory autonomy and frictionless trade within the state, which then has implications for being able to sign international treaties with trading partners who want access to the whole of that market. So there's a question there about how exactly that works. The second aspect is how sub-regional governments are involved in national decisions. So, for example, how they're involved in trade agreements. If we look at somewhere like Austria, the Länder have the ability to kind of make a statement and input into negotiating positions where it has implications for their own competencies. In somewhere like Belgium, kind of international relations is completely within the competence of some of these regions. And so they essentially have a veto over trade agreements. And we saw the big drama over the Walloon Parliament not approving the CETA deal. So there are kind of different levels of that. I think the problem when we talk about both the system for regulating the internal market and input into national trade agreements is the fact that the UK has these slightly strange structures in that the UK government is the government of kind of one part of the UK, and that it's the government of England in some areas, but it's also the government of the UK. And similarly, we can see the same problem with the UK Parliament, which means that it feels like the system for regulating the internal market, rather than being kind of agreed between multiple regional governments or the kind of federal government that sits above and is kind of slightly more kind of impartial or neutral, it feels like this is a system that has essentially been imposed by England. And similarly, when trade deals are signed, again, it feels like that's a decision that is prioritising one part of the UK. So it's not an easy answer, but I think part of the answer is to think about how we conceive of the UK, whether this kind of unitary straight is still appropriate in the times in which we are.
I mean, I think having spoken to members of the SNP, you're leading to the question of why people want greater independence, aren't you? And your answer is that if a party that you're not a part of is in control of your your region and also of a country that you're unified with, that it adds layers of problems. Vaughan, when I come to you, I also want to just say that we did an event looking at the Australia trade deal, and there was a lot of talk from the farmers about the concerns around that, and I'm thinking of that in terms of international trade and regulations, and what you think when you draw out your answer, if you could just give an aspect of what that future trade deal could mean for Wales as well.
Okay, do you want me to start? Or do you want
Yes, please. No, I'll go to you first, please.
Okay, so I agree a lot of Jess's analysis about where we are, and there are other parts of the world where there are different models available. You know, Canada again is another one where they have interaction with their provincial governments. They understand the need to manage that at a federal government level, but there's clarity that there is a federal government and provincial governments, and you know, we have this odd position of a UK Parliament that's also acting for England at various points in time as well. But I think that, you know, we've been really clear with the UK government that trade policy should not set domestic policy in areas that are devolved and have been for 20 years. The difficulty comes going back to some of our first questions about the fact there are times where reserved areas end up butting up into and having an impact onto devolved government-devolved competence. And the only way to resolve it is to have earlier engagement and involvement so we can understand those tensions and resolve them first. And to be fair, when we were part of the European Union, Welsh ministers regularly had conversations with ministers in Scotland, Northern Ireland and the UK government in trying to agree a UK position before going into the European Union Council of Ministers. So there is actually a history and a memory only a few years ago of different ministers agreeing on a position or understanding the their position before it happened, before the UK line is then taken. And actually, I don't think it's that difficult to recreate it if the will is there. That's what I hope the intergovernmental relations will allow us to do. On current trade policy with the rest of the world, we are really concerned that essential agriculture is being offered up as a makeway to not understanding the impact of that across the whole of the UK, in particular what it means for Wales, because it isn't just what it means for agriculture as a production and economic sector. Actually, what that means for rural life and for the Welsh language is really important, and it's not taken account of. And the danger in the Australian deal is it sets a precedent. The percentage increase on the quota is really significant. And if that happens in New Zealand and other areas too, you could actually find that there's a very real threat to agriculture, not just one that might exist at a long and distant point in the future. It was willingness to stay in the industry and to invest in the future as well. And also, I'd much prefer if we could have some more clarity on animal welfare standards and other things that I think are important across the UK too. The current text, though, the draft text on climate change and any other things was positive. I know there were headlines about moving back on that, but the text that was there actually helped us to move forward. So there are things that we can agree with and work to that would set a positive standard for future trade deals, as well as the plain risks that the agriculture deal provides for us here in Wales and I guess across the rest of the UK as well.
Thank you. And I know that we've been running over slightly on time. So,
yes, we need to keep time.
So if Ivan could just answer before I hand back to the chair, but just bearing in mind everyone's run over, so I'm trying to make up time. Thank you.
Good for you. Yeah, I'll be brief. I agree with much of what Vaughan said with regards to the Australia deal. It does set a precedent, and the challenges there for the agriculture sector are stark. But also, as Vaughan rightly said, you're looking for specifics around about animal health and welfare is an area we've communicated strongly to the UK government that we are concerned. But in terms of the general principle of your question, this clearly is it's a situation that exists in countries all around the world. The US has been mentioned previously. Access to the US market and services is largely determined at a state level, but the US has some quite well-structured processes whereby states are able to input to any changes to that environment at a federal level. So there are plenty of opportunities, and even just looking back to the way the EU operates within its member states, when it takes forward common trading positions with third countries, there are plenty of precedents we can learn from, and I think it's down to the UK government to approach this with an attitude of they're trying to find a solution that works for everybody, and not as up to now being, as it has been articulated, them acting as they see fit and everyone else has to fall into line.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to the chair. Thank you very much for your answers.
Clara. Thank you, and that's a good segue, Aidan, into your questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Jess, it's lovely to see you again, but I'm not asking you any questions this morning. You're lucky you're getting off the hook. I want to look at the wider trade deals, and particularly we've been hearing over this past few months about all the different trade deals that have either been speculated or that have been rolled over. I'm going to start with Ivan and then Vaughan. I have two questions. The first one is, what discussions have been held between the UK government and the devolved governments over future trade relationships, and do you feel adequately consulted?
I would say no, there has been discussion, but we are always running to catch up in terms of we get information right at the last minute on what's happening. We don't get impact assessment shared with us. We don't get sight of the negotiating position and the approach the UK is taking in terms of those very important trade-offs when it comes down to the wire on trade deals. So we are, shall we say, we have conversations, but we absolutely don't feel that our opinions are included as we would hope that they should be, and particularly where those trade deals impact on devolved matters.
Vaughan, if you wouldn't mind answering that as well, please.
Yeah, look, I think I've covered a good bit of this previously about good personal relationships, good relationships between officials. In areas that are plainly devolved, there's a greater recognition of the importance to talk to us, less so in areas that are reserved. But actually, there has been some improvement in that in the conversations around New Zealand compared to Australia, where we did these things when they were published. There's been engagement on us with those, but of course, because the Australia deal in principle already exists, there are things to talk about. And I'd like to see that again formalised in a way where we don't have to keep on coming back to this with each and every single potential new free trade agreement.
I think that is a view that's shared in Northern Ireland as well, as far as that formalisation of process, and that will allow proper consultation. Moving on then to the second question, obviously there's the Scottish and Welsh offices through FCDO in Brussels, but have the devolved governments sought any relationships with the EU or other countries with which the UK is negotiating? Have you been reaching out the feelers to those countries? Vaughan, if I start with you this time, please.
Well, we do have representation within Brussels and within other countries. So we have envoys, we have direct relationships with subnational regions and nations. We have well-developed relationships and agreements with the Basque Country, for example, as well as a presence within Brussels. Then I think part of the difficulty is that occasionally the UK government are suspicious of devolved governments having any activity with other governments around the world and seeing us almost as giving away or undermining the UK position. We've always tried to be straight about what we're doing and why. We need to understand the position other people are taking because it directly affects our ability to go and influence the course of Welsh economic interests apart from anything else. So we've had those relationships and we continue to have them, and we've been open with the UK government about where we're active and why. And we think that it would be helpful if that were reciprocated. It would benefit us as well as the whole UK, I think.
Well, has that been more of a priority for the Welsh Government over this past 2 years?
Well, since we left the European Union, we don't then have directly elected representatives. The work of our Brussels office has been important in understanding the mood music and what's going around. But again, I wouldn't characterise that as looking for a way to disagree with the UK government, because we have those disagreements here and we try to have those discussions here. But it is about making sure that intelligence exists for how we discharge our responsibilities to support the future of the Welsh economy.
Thank you, Vaughan. Ivan, has the Scottish Government been putting out those feelers and building those relationships with wider countries?
I mean, we value our international relationships. Scotland is an outward-looking, international-facing country, and we've always had engagement internationally. I think it's important to say at the outset that clearly, where there are formal negotiating channels where there are matters that national governments are talking to each other in a formal sense. Clearly, we are not, nor would we seek to be part of that process at that level. We do that through the UK channels while we are still part of the UK. And neither would the EU or other countries or other member states of the EU have those discussions on those matters directly with us. That everyone respects those processes. But having said that, of course, we have those discussions, but we have broader discussions around about aspects of what we're working on, our policy priorities, areas for cooperation at a national and a subnational level. We have our network of Scottish Government offices now in how many, 6, 7 countries around the world, with Poland and the Nordics soon to be added to that network. We have our Scottish Development International Trading and Investment offices in 30 countries. We have our trade envoys, we have our Global Scots, we've got a whole range of international engagement. We engage through EU bodies like the Vanguard Initiative, which we're still part of despite Brexit. But we also work very closely with DIT. I meet with ambassadors, UK ambassadors on my international trips. I engage closely with UK trade commissioners. So we work together where it makes sense to promote Scottish interests, but we also reach out and engage proactively on areas of common interest and sharing of perspectives with countries, national level and the subnational level globally.
Thank you both for those very illuminating answers. And back to you, Chair, but I believe we're back on time.
We're back on time. Thank you very much, everyone. We're now going to have the last question of this part of the session before we're joined by industrial representatives, and Shira would try and pull together some specific recommendations for the future.
Yeah, so thanks for all the witnesses. This was really interesting, and this is the summative part of the session, really. One of the ideas behind the Commission is to be able to make recommendations for improvement. And all of you've talked about structures for collaboration and joint working either not being in place or not being activated. And I just would like to hear from each of you very briefly what you think the 1 or 2 major steps the UK government needs to take in order to improve relationships with devolved governments. And can I start with you, Jess?
Thanks. I mean, first and foremost, we've already mentioned it, but I think one of the most important things that can be done in the short term is to conclude the review of intergovernmental relations and implement that as soon as possible. I think we're hopefully nearly there, and I think that could go a long way to kind of formalising relationships, having a proper dispute resolution procedure, having an independent secretariat so that IGR structures feel more jointly owned. I think could all be really positive in improving intergovernmental relations. Specifically on the trade element, I think one of the things that the UK government could do is include the devolved administrations more in the room in some of these kind of discussions on the negotiations, on the TCA or on the Northern Ireland Protocol. It might sound a bit kind of radical at the moment, given that relationships are perhaps a bit frayed, but I think that could help in kind of get a sense of collective ownership of some of these agreements. And as I said, I think in a lot of areas there are more shared interests between the UK and the devolved administrations than there are differences in position. And I think we need to kind of build on that and make sure that trade agreements are more jointly owned. So those are my 2 things.
Thank you. Vaughan?
I agree with much of what Jess just said. And, going back to Ivan's previous answer, there are Welsh Government offices around the world as well, looking to promote trade and cooperation. We have visits from international ambassadors. We've had the ambassador from Canada and Japan visit us recently. There are bilateral arrangements that exist that don't cut across UK interests in doing so. And we see that in the way we promote businesses around the world. In the areas where there is a potential disagreement, making progress on genuine dispute resolution is hugely important. Because at the moment, and I'll give you an example, in the previous administration, when there was an agreement on confidence supply with a sum of money that was part of it and was paid into Northern Ireland, Welsh and I think Scottish Government both said, we think there's a dispute because there's no consequential. The response to the Treasury was, there is no dispute, and that was it. So there wasn't even an attempt to have a conversation about it. And that's really harmful and doesn't get us to somewhere sensible. So having a conclusion to the review, the progress and common frameworks, I think will put us in a much better place. because we have shown it is possible to have sensible and grown-up conversations. We've had those at various stages in the pandemic as well. So it is possible to talk and to find areas of agreement, but also where we disagree, to be much clearer about why we disagree and to be able to manage those effectively and properly. So I am hopeful that robust intergovernmental machinery with clearer and fairer ways to manage disputes when they exist, but more importantly, to avoid disputes arising in the first place is actually really important for all of us. Thank you. That's really clear. And finally, Ivan.
Yes, I mean, to round off this this part of the session, I'll maintain the level of agreement. I agree with much of what has been said so far on this. I think from a UK government perspective, it's about recognising that there needs a more constructive approach to it. It's about recognising that other countries have done this, in some cases done it well, and we should seek to learn from that. It's about reading and looking at the documents we've published on this, which have put forward proposals on how these issues could be challenged. It's about working to get those frameworks and the machinery that supports that as effective as possible, recognising, as Vaughan said, that there are many areas where we'll agree and areas where we disagree. We need to be clear about that and understand how we approach that. It's about taking forward and getting the Concordat on international trade and finalised and agreed. And I suppose it's at its core, it's about respecting devolution and legitimate interests and responsibilities that devolved administrations have. Starting from there, I think we can make good progress.
Thank you. Those were very clear and concise answers, and it doesn't sound like rocket science, but thank you for that. I'm going to hand back to the chair, and we're going to move on to the second part of this session.
Thanks, Shira. And I'd like to thank each of our witnesses very, very much indeed for their contribution to that, both illuminating and thought-provoking. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew Ballheimer to introduce the second half of the session, where we'll look at more specific economic impacts and reactions that we need to consider to those. Andrew.
Thanks, Peter. Well chaired, yeah, on time or even earlier, ahead of time, obviously, impressive. Thank you, everyone, for the questions up to now. I'd like to welcome our new witnesses who are going to introduce themselves in a minute. The topic of this session is impact of the trade policy on Welsh and Scottish industry. So I'll pass you to each of the witnesses in turn, who can please offer a brief overview of their role and position. Elspeth.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me here today to give some perspectives to the Commission from the Scottish fishing industry. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. The Federation is made up of 8 constituent associations, and we have around about 450 fishing vessels within the membership of those associations. And we have a very broad church, if you like, in terms of the members that we represent. We have all different types of shellfish fishing sectors, so shell fisheries, demersal fisheries, the whitefish, and our pelagic fisheries. And we also represent a very wide range of sizes and shapes of fishing vessels, so everything from the very largest to the very smallest. So, as I say, quite a broad church. I think maybe perhaps useful just to give a sense of perspective. We in Scotland, the fishing industry accounts for around about 60% of the, in fact, slightly in excess of 60% of the total UK landings of fish and shellfish, both in terms of tonnage and in terms of value. So, the majority of the sector sits north of the border. So, I hope that's a flavour of who I represent, and be very happy to answer your questions today as we go through the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elspeth. Dylan?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the invitation today. My name's Dylan Morgan. I'm a Deputy Director and a Head of Policy for NFU Cymru, so the National Farmers Union in Wales. We represent farmers and growers across the length and breadth of Wales, sort of covering all sectors and all areas of Wales. Obviously, given that sort of around 80% of Wales is what's classified as less favoured, so basically hills and uplands, really, we are very much a grass-based system in Wales, so very much our production is based around dairy, beef and sheep, but we do also have some small but significant sectors of poultry production and cropping in Wales. And yeah, as you say, I look forward to discussing the issues and how sort of trade and devolution impacts on our sector over the next 3/4 of an hour.
Thank you, Dylan. And finally, James.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everyone. Like Elspeth and Dylan, really appreciate the opportunity to give evidence to the Commission, the work of which we've been following closely and really welcome. James Withers, I'm Chief Executive of Scotland Food and Drink. Scotland Food and Drink, I suppose, has two parts to its life. We're a membership organisation. We've got about 430 companies in the food and drink supply chain that are members of ours, and they'll range from small artisan food producers to multinational companies and everything in between. The second part to what we do, we also coordinate a public-private partnership in Scotland. So we bring together the different sectors of the food and drink industry alongside Scottish Government and its agencies, working collectively to grow the sector, both its value and its reputation. A sector that's worth around, or was prior to Brexit and COVID, worth around about 16.5 billion to Scotland's economy and its biggest single export. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So when I get into questions, the ground rules asks, we have 7 minutes for each of the questions, split across each of the witnesses, if that's okay. I'll kick off if that's fine. So the first point is, are there particular impacts of leaving the EU or as a result of new trade deals for Welsh and Scottish businesses? I'll start with Elspeth, if that's okay. And fish clearly has been adversely impacted by the TCA, but...
Yeah, certainly. A lot of what we catch in the UK and in Scotland is exported. So we export quite a lot of fish and seafood to the EU and beyond the EU. So clearly the biggest impact of the exiting of the EU and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was the now exporting into the EU as a third country rather than as part of the single market. So that brought with it, and I'm sure James will touch on this too, and Dylan, I'm sure, new requirements for exporters in terms of a new administration, new bureaucracy, new paperwork, and additional cost that comes with that. So that's been the biggest impact, I would say, in relation to trade as a consequence of leaving the EU. It is that issue of now exporting into the EU as a third country, as opposed to being part of the single market. Clearly, there was a huge fisheries element of the negotiations separately, if you like, in terms of not so much about the trade element, but more about the negotiations of fisheries, access to fishing waters, quota negotiations, etc. The fishing industry in the UK had really hoped that that would be an opportunity for the UK to be able to make far greater benefit of the resources within UK waters. That outcome has not come to pass. The settlement on fisheries has been pretty disappointing. Perhaps more opportunity in the future, but certainly in the short term, nothing like the ability for us to really be able to expand the sector and have greater access to the fishery resources in our own water. So that side of the negotiation certainly very disappointing from the fishing industry perspective. And as I say, in relation to trade, the main issue has been the change in that trading relationship with the EU.
And the new trade deals, any sort of upside as well for the new trade deals?
I think too early to say yet, but certainly we see a market for seafood well beyond the EU and the UK. There's certainly been a growing market, certainly pre-COVID, and hopefully recovering in parts of Southeast Asia. We've got businesses who are keen to be trading more perhaps into the US. So certainly opportunities there that we would be keen to develop.
Thank you very much. Dylan.
No, thanks. Well, you know, in terms of Wales, obviously we are an agriculture and a food producing nation, so we generally produce far more food than we consume in Wales. So access to export markets is extremely important to us, and over the years the EU has been crucial to that. And I think in terms of Wales, we've generally exported more to the EU than on average other countries across the UK. And in particular with regards to our agri-food and drink exports prior to Brexit, around 3/4 of our exports would go to the EU market. So absolutely crucial for us. With regards to the TCA earlier on this year, obviously it was welcome news that was agreed at the last moment. Our view all along was that we wanted to continue with sort of tariff-free and friction-free trade to the EU. We were pleased that we've maintained the tariff-free, but as Elizabeth has mentioned, we have got that friction being introduced into the trading relationship now. And particularly for all of us on the call this morning, when we're dealing with sort of animals and plants, for example, the animal and plant health regulations and the rules around that, do put in place significant friction for our businesses for that. And I think, whilst there are a number of reasons for the export figures that we've seen in the first half of the year, if you just look at sort of two of our key exporting sectors, beef exports are down 31% and sheep exports are down by 1/4 really since the start of the year. So clearly it's having a big impact on us really, and what concerning for us what that might have long term. In terms of the new trade deals, I mean, I think those have been sort of really the main issue for us the last few months, because it appears that the UK government are negotiating really with countries that have major offensive interests within agriculture. And obviously we've seen the agreement in principle with Australia, which is a huge concern to us. And obviously we're quite far on now in terms of negotiations with New Zealand, again, another major exporting country. And so, there is concern amongst our members with regards to the potential impacts that could have.
What are the countries, that would actually help you if we had a new trade agreement with?
What are the countries? Well, as I mentioned, the most important thing for us is to be able to maintain and continue to build those markets in Europe. I think there are certainly opportunities for us in the Middle and Far East with a number of those countries over there. What we do tend to find with a lot of those countries, though, it's not so much having a trade deal with them, it's overcoming those barriers around the sanitary and phytosanitary rules and regulations around there. So it's not necessarily the trade deal that's hindered us in the past, is getting over those rules. But as I mentioned, we are an exporting nation. We are supportive of opening up new markets, provided they're sort of fair for all as such.
Thank you. James.
So the impact of the type of Brexit that was pursued has certainly been acute in Scotland. And one of the reasons for that is because, as Dylan and Elspeth have alluded to, the importance of the farming, fishing, food and drink industry is significantly greater in devolved areas of the UK than it is for the UK as a whole. So to put that in a bit of perspective, clearly food and drink manufacturing is important across the UK. It's, as a manufacturing sector, it's worth more than aviation and automotive combined. But in a Scottish context, food and drink manufacturing is twice as important to the Scottish economy as it is to the UK as a whole. And food and drink exports are 4 times as important to the Scottish economy as they are to the UK as a whole. And the hard Brexit that has been pursued has caused huge damage to that export trade, certainly in the short term, with real questions as to whether we can recover some of that. And that will require solutions to be pursued, whether veterinary agreements or other things. The other element I would add in from a Scottish perspective is the proliferation of SMEs that we have. So we have a lot of businesses that do not have departments that deal with export bureaucracy and paperwork. So the lack of preparedness that they had in losing a transition period to a pandemic, in having 7 hours from a Brexit deal till its implementation on the 1st of January, and a matter of hours from the final publication of the border operating model, and aside from government systems not being ready, was particularly acute on smaller businesses, many of whom have not resumed export trade with the European Union because it is just frankly too difficult too costly and there's not enough margin in it. And clearly these would be SMEs that use mechanisms like groupage and consolidated exports, which have remained, which have been amongst the most negatively impacted by the type of Brexit that we've got. So a huge impact on devolved nations, and an impact that I personally don't believe was understood by negotiators. And to be honest, part of me actually hopes it wasn't understood, because if it was, you reach a more unsettling conclusion, which is that it was just priced in as collateral damage that was worth accepting in order to get a deal. But it's been very, very acute, certainly on Scotland, and because of the nature of the importance of our farming, fishing, food and drink industry to our economy.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the floor to Alison.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witnesses. So I'd like to hear from you about the opportunity for the devolved governments to do more independent promotion around trade and investment, and whether you think there's an opportunity for them to do more, and what kind of opportunities that would provide to the businesses you represent. So if we could hear from Elspeth first, please.
Thank you. I'm sure from a Scottish context, James will talk in some detail about this, but I think the devolved governments do, certainly in the context of Scotland, certainly do make considerable efforts. I think, as James described, the relative importance of the food and drink sector to the Scottish economy is such that this has always been a priority area for them. I think through bodies, through public sector body or publicly funded bodies, the likes of Seafood Scotland in my sector, but also through that sort of wider Scottish development and enterprise networks, the Scottish government, and I think Minister McKee spoke about this earlier in his session, there's I think a considerable network of contacts, on the ground experts, in market specialists that are working very hard in key markets for Scottish produce to try and develop and grow our exports into these territories. And I think there's a lot of good work that's already been done, and I think we would be very keen for that to continue.
Thank you. James, is there anything you want to add to cover the kind of the Scottish perspective, and then move on to Dylan?
I would echo what Elspeth has said. There's a huge amount going on, and in fact this has been done for about 20 years now. So the development of the food and drink industry as a sector has been a devolved issue since 1999, and a huge amount of effort has gone into developing this trade. So as an example, in Market Specialists we have a global team of food and drink specialists on the ground in key markets, and have done since 2014. They are jointly funded by the industry and Scottish Government working together, and that follows a model that Ireland and New Zealand have had for many years. One of the reasons that devolved nations, I think in particular, took the lead on this, and I think Wales have done a fantastic job in building their brand, building their presence in international markets. One of the reasons devolved nations took such a lead is because food and drink and the promotion of exports in our sector wasn't a priority for UK government for years, and we all understood that. The likes of Food from Britain had its funding cut, was abolished back in 2009. So in many ways, devolved nations filled that gap in terms of driving and developing the leadership for that trade and investment promotion. What has changed more recently has been that the UK government has become more interested in that, and even just, I think, a week ago, 10 days ago, UK government announced they're going to follow the model of putting more in market specialists on the ground. One of the challenges with that is how do we make sure that the UK government work, which is welcome in the food and drink area, complements what's happening in devolved areas and doesn't run across the top of it? Because we've had some bad experiences, if I'm honest, in the last few years of where UK government has started to get busy in this area, but has cut across what has been happening in devolved areas. Brand would be a good example. The Great brand used now around the world was developed without any involvement of devolved nations, despite the fact Wales had developed their brand, Scotland had developed our Land of Food and Drink brand, and had done it for a decade or so. And it needs a better culture of collaboration from UK government if we're going to make the most of Brand Britain and Brand Scotland and Brand Wales. And our experience has been that just has not been the case. But in terms of the level of work that has gone on in Scotland, it's been great and phenomenal success. We've doubled our food exports in a decade. Admittedly, that's now taken a step backwards because 2/3 of our food exports go to the European Union.
And do you have any recommendations of how to create that collaborative relationship and avoid those scenarios of cutting across?
So I think it's a big cultural piece about how devolved nations, the UK government work together. I really question in a post-Brexit environment whether the structures of devolution are fit for purpose. One of the announcements last week was around an export council, the idea of the 4 nations coming together on an equal basis to look at the markets we're interested in, to share insight, and crucially to operationally do things well. We've had trade missions before where we've had UK government and Scottish government trying to recruit the same companies for the same trip to the same market at the same time. Just makes us all look rather daft. So having a mechanism which allows both ministerially and officials to work more collectively would be a big step forward. But I'll be honest, it just does not exist at the moment, either on, certainly not on developing trade policy, but even in terms of that export market development strategy. We need a much more collaborative approach from all 4 nations in working together on that.
Okay, thank you. Dylan, do you have anything to add? Is there anything more the Welsh Government could be doing?
I just support what's already been said by my Scottish colleagues, really. I think with regards to us in Wales, similar to Scotland, we've had food and drink strategies operating through our Welsh Government for the past 20 years. And the most recent one ran from 2014 to 2020 and saw, a 30% growth in terms of the industry in Wales to 7.5 billion, really. So I think, we've gone ahead and done that. We've got a very strong food and drink industry board in Wales who operates and sort of leads that strategy, and obviously looking to move forward, and our levy body does similar, really. So I think there's a lot of good work that's been done. What we've got to do is obviously not rest on our laurels and look to build on that. I just echo a little bit of what James said, really. I think in the last couple of years we have seen a little bit from the UK government almost trying to put sort of tanks on our lawn as such with regards to what we've done in Wales through their sort of great British export approach, really. And I think, similar to what James has said, I think there's a way that we can all work together rather than try and be across wires, really. I think it's important that all of the UK devolves work together to open up our markets and to make sure that we can remove any barriers in place. But once we get into those markets, I think it's important that we give, each country those opportunities then to build and grow their brand within those markets. Now, in many instances, they'll want to work to be able to on their own product to build up. But there may be occasions as well where it's still in all our interests, really, to work together to grow and sell a product there. But that should be in the gift of each individual nation, rather than one nation sort of imposing on anyone else how we go about growing our markets overseas.
Thank you. Thanks for your answers.
Thanks, Alison. Stephen Farry has the floor next, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I think these questions have been slightly picked up upon given the nature of these discussions, but just to maybe ask for a little bit more elaboration. There's probably 2 different elements to this. The first one relates to non-tariff barriers, the regulatory barriers. In Northern Ireland, we're very keen on having a veterinary agreement, which would ease a lot of the pressures around the protocol. I'm just wondering, also from a Scottish and Welsh perspective, given the much greater emphasis upon agri-food and fisheries, to what extent those are viewed as critical issues from a UK-wide perspective in terms of exporting in to the European Union. And the second question, if people could just pick up on this as well, is around the nature of trade deals themselves and the danger of a one-size-fits-all approach to negotiating deals, where obviously the scale of England and perhaps even the industries of the southeast of England will skew the nature of what the UK prioritises in those discussions, with obviously the particular vulnerability being agriculture, which would be a much bigger proportion of the economies of Scotland, Wales, and indeed for ourselves in Northern Ireland. So essentially 2 different questions to each of the witnesses, and perhaps James, Elspeth, and then Dylan, please, in that order.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Farry. And I suppose the first thing to say is a veterinary agreement, is a single most important step that could be taken to improve the trade with the European Union. And that's because, you know, if I look at just food exports from Scotland, seafood and red meat are two of our most significant products of animal origin, and now caught in a tsunami of paperwork and bureaucracy, which adds little in terms of assurance for EU customers, but adds an awful lot in terms of cost and complexity and challenge for businesses that are here. And I think this is about, again, the type of Brexit pursuit. The TCA is a framework. It creates opportunities to drive solutions. And that is one where, you know, we desperately need some progress. It's really challenging. We have massively struggled to have that engagement with UK government. We've tried for months now to have a meeting with Lord Frost, and 3 times it's been in the diary and has been cancelled. We need to be able to find a mechanism to have those kind of discussions. No one's trying to unpick the principle of Brexit. There's just a smarter way to do this. On trade deals and your question there, again, you know, it goes back to the importance of agriculture to Northern Ireland for sure. And we work closely with our Northern Irish counterparts, our Welsh colleagues, and the importance of agriculture to Scotland. There's no doubt there's a massive nervousness that you know, agriculture is sold down the river in order to secure a deal around financial services or car parts. And why would we say that? You know, what evidence is that for fear? There's a history to this. We've seen, you know, where we've not had our PGIs, our protected geographical indicators, protected in deals that have been done elsewhere. The Australian deal has been the kind of precedent in starting new free trade, has been done in the dark. There's been no real engagement with industry whatsoever. And when there's no engagement, that's what starts to fuel fears that there is something happening that could have a huge impact, as Dylan says, given the way we've embraced world-class standards here and the risk that they could get undercut due to the priorities of some other sectors. So we desperately need, particularly the recommendations of the Trade and Agriculture Commission, to be grasped and taken forward. There's a lack of transparency, a lack of dialogue, and certainly a lack of recognition of the importance of some of these sectoral issues to devolved nations, and we need structures to be able to reflect that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Elspeth?
Thank you. At the start of this year, when the seafood sector was very quickly faced with all these new non-tariff barriers that we've spoken about already, and I mentioned at the start of the session, you know, it became apparent very quickly that businesses were struggling to deal with some of these new requirements, many of these new requirements, as for many of the reasons that James outlined earlier, in terms of the very little time that there was to adjust, etc. And both governments pulled industry people together very swiftly, and were very keen to hear about, you know, what solutions were needed and what could be done to essentially expedite these problems and get around them and find ways to make things work better, make the exports easier to get through the system. So certainly, as part of these discussions that took place earlier in this year, there was talk around, you know, veterinary agreements, what that would bring. Would that reduce the requirements for a lot of the SPS burdens, that the new requirements that have come into place there. So veterinary agreements certainly very much discussed in the context of these immediate problems that we faced at the beginning of the year. In relation to those wider points about trade deals, I mean, I think, as James has alluded to, the importance of the size and the importance of the seafood and the food and drink sector to the devolved administration, to the devolved countries, to Scotland, you know, hugely, it's hugely apparent how critical it is that the impacts of deals on these sectors are fully taken into account. I mean, I think we saw very clearly in the negotiation of the Brexit deal, while the government was saying all the right things about negotiating the right outcome on fisheries, that did not come to pass. And I'm sure there were strong reasons, and the importance of getting a wider deal that meant that there were sacrifices made in relation to fishing. So I think that's absolutely something that we must be alive to in any future trade deals that the government makes.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Dylan.
No, thanks. Well, look, I just agree with everything that's been said so far with regards to veterinary agreements, and just going back to what I said earlier, really, as an exporting nation, it is so important to us that we can move across borders friction free, really. So anything that we can do to make sure that continues to happen is vitally important to us. So it's absolutely crucial that we get that. With regards to the wider issues, as I mentioned in my response to the first question, really, the trade deals that have been negotiated and are being negotiated at the moment are with countries that have major agricultural exporting interest, really. So, as a Welsh farmer, I'm struggling to see sort of any benefit really from what we're at there, really. And when you talk about the numbers just for Australia, for example, in terms of what they'll be allowed to bring in tariff-free from day one, with sort of in terms of beef and lamb, it sort of dwarfs what they can bring into the whole of the EU at the moment, really. So huge potential impact from us. And we were talking about, an exporting nation where 62% of their cattle are on feedlots of over 10,000 cattle, where your average size of a beef herd in Wales is around 23. I think when we look at things as well, though, we need to go beyond the economic impact, really. And I think that's something we've highlighted many times in Wales. We need to look at the impact that these trade deals could potentially have, really, with regards to sort of culture and our language and everything else. Like, for example, in terms of Wales, sort of 43% of our farmers speak Welsh, our first language Welsh, really. What impact, really, will these trade deals potentially have on some of those impacts? And again, as you mentioned, in terms of different impacts in different parts of the country, in parts of Wales, sort of a third of the people are directly employed in agriculture, and a significant number of businesses, rely on a significant proportion of their income from agriculture. And that's not just your supplies, your veterinary supplies, or your agricultural feed merchants. As in towns where I live in, the accountant, the lawyer, the builders, the plumbers, they all rely on farmers for a huge amount of their business, really. And I think our concern is that really hasn't been taken into account, that impact it can have, at a local level, some of these trade deals.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Dylan. And those are important points just to conclude with around the nature of what are effectively often small or medium-sized family farms as opposed to industrial scale enterprises in all three of the devolved regions, and then the wider supply chain that is based around that. And if that all goes, that will have a major impact in terms of the economic and social and cultural life of many, many rural communities in particular. So back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Stephen. Paul Gerben has the floor next, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank the panel for their responses so far. I'm just going to ask in relation to what kind of impact assessment is conducted on trade deals affecting devolved governments, and would there be an opportunity in the case of a negative impact to force a renegotiation or compensation? And I look along the lines of the additional paperwork that's required on many cases where we actually have higher standards, even in veterinary aspects, to what Europe are trying to put forward. So, we have to comply by Europe's intransigence in relation to what we can deal with in Northern Ireland, and looking at Northern Ireland in particular, where we have very high welfare, animal welfare considerations, as well as veterinary controls put in place. And Europe are demanding additional paperwork, and as such are excluding some of our farmers from markets because they just cannot be bothered. I don't mean bothered. They find the bureaucracy of filling in all the additional paperwork too prohibitive in accessing those markets. I'll ask that to Dylan first, probably.
No, thanks. So in terms of impact assessment, I mean, that's something very much that we've called for, is to make sure that, ahead of entering into negotiations, that there's a proper impact assessment done, which looks at the impact across each devolved administration, rather than just looking at it at a UK level, for the reasons we talked about in the previous question, really. And I think it's vitally important that's done before entering into negotiations, because the problem with an impact assessment after negotiations is that the deal's pretty much been done as such, really. I mean, I think internally in Wales, working alongside Welsh Government, we've had what's called an evidence and scenarios group, and I think we have done quite a lot of good work looking at that potentially in terms of the impact on land use, perhaps not enough with regards to the economic impact. But, you know, unfortunately, again, that's not something that holds sway with UK government, or something that they would be looking at ahead of negotiations. I think in terms of renegotiation or compensation, I mean, that's a really difficult question to answer, really. I mean, I think the trouble is with compensation or something like that, you know, there are talk about sort of market management groups being set up in Wales going forward to sort of replicate what we previously had in the CAP. But, you know, that is only in times of crisis as such, really. I don't think any of us want to get to that situation and have to ask for compensation at that moment in time. I think James mentioned earlier on with regards to standards, the importance that we all see with regards to the Trade and Agriculture Commission. And I think that's a vital a piece of work for ourselves, really. And we're still disappointed that the UK government hasn't given an official response to the Commission's report and set up the statutory commissions, because I think it's important that that can get to work as soon as possible, really, to be able to support parliamentarians, really, in scrutinising deals going forward. I think maybe the biggest thing with regards to what we can do could potentially be around comprehensive spending review and ensuring that the devolves have the finance needed to be able to underpin high quality food production. And I think with regards to us in Wales, we're particularly now looking at future agricultural policy. You know, a lot of work had been done on what a future agriculture policy could look like prior to us knowing the sort of trading relationship we're in now with Europe and UK government's policy with regards to other trade deals. And I think, you know, there's very much an opportunity, or we should be looking again at future agriculture and food policy on the basis of what we know now with regards to that policy. And I think we really need to make sure that policy continues to underpin and support high quality food production and the standards, you know, that we're proud to produce to, and our consumer expects from us.
Thank you, Dylan. Could I ask the same question to James?
Sure. So I think, you know, the challenge with impact assessments has been their lack of existence, or certainly the lack of visibility. And certainly one of the scarring effects that Brexit has had, I suppose, on the trade agenda and trade culture in the UK and with industry is that lack of real understanding as to what the impact would be of trying to, in particular, impose the EU's third country import model onto a country like the UK that is so integrated into its supply chains, that deals with large volumes of sometimes small consignments, individual consignments of fresh product that needs to complete a journey in 24 hours, not frozen New Zealand lamb that frankly has a long shelf life, and really difficult and interesting to get a head around. I mean, if you're a farmer and you want to remove a ditch from one of your fields, you need to do an impact assessment. And yet we had the biggest single trading change for the whole of the UK in a lifetime, affecting our biggest market without that. Now, that can't be the baseline for how we go forward. I'm told there are impact assessments internally within DIT around other FTAs being negotiated, Australia and others, but they're not visible to industry. And, you know, as industry, you know, we're grown up enough to know we're not going to get everything we want out of a trade deal. Trade deals are a process of trade-offs, and we understand that. And you know, the aviation, automotive, financial services, we can't get everything we want, but we have to have an understanding of what the impact might be on individual industries in order to understand what the overall picture of benefit might be for UK PLC. And I suppose, Mr. Girvan, the one challenge I have, I suppose, with the question, which is, does an impact assessment help force a renegotiation or compensation? It implies slightly that the impact assessment, as Dylan says, comes after you've got ink on the paper or something, at which point it's too late. And there are really good models that exist elsewhere where you have business and government delegations working collectively, the likes of New Zealand, during the negotiation piece. And we don't have that at the moment. And that might be because we haven't done this for 40 years and we're just getting used to doing it. But the early forays into global Britain as a trading nation have not been good from a business point of view. And I think impact assessments will be critical to that. And where there are negative impacts, because the greater prize for UK PLC is out there and worth it, then I think compensation and support for industries to adjust will be absolutely critical.
Okay, thank you, Elspeth.
Thank you. Yes, echo very much what James has just said there. I think I would assume and imagine there are indeed impact assessments within UK government on these trade deals, but they certainly have not seen the light of day insofar as industry has been concerned. I was a civil servant for very many years before I took this job, and in a similar situation to James describing his farmer digging a ditch, civil servants taking forward even a relatively trivial piece of legislation would have to provide an impact assessment and indeed consult on that impact assessment to allow stakeholders to improve it, add data into it, etc. So it is, I think, perplexing that, as has already been described as the biggest change to our trading relationship for generations, appears to not have been subject to any such assessment, or certainly not one that industry or others have been able to contribute to. In relation to your point about compensation, I think what we saw in seafood at the very early stages of this year was a recognition from both governments, both the UK government and the Scottish government, that the seafood sector had been hit very hard, very quickly by the impacts of these changes. And there certainly was some short-term funding made available to businesses to try to mitigate the impacts of that. But that was by no means a long-term or a structural change. It was simply and indeed welcome financial support to businesses that had been hit and were suffering some very significant impacts in the short term. I think something that Scottish Government have done is they've recognised the importance of the seafood sector to Scotland, and they are in the process of undertaking a piece of work to look at a future seafood trade policy. And I think we very much welcome that in terms of recognising the importance of this sector, not just to those who go to sea to catch fish, but also indeed to those who farm fish in Scotland, and also to the coastal communities around Scotland that depend on these industries. So I think the recognition of the importance of the sector to Scotland, the fact that the Scottish Government is now giving considered and focused thought to a future trade policy for seafood is very welcome, and we've been part of those conversations and look forward to seeing how that will develop.
Thank you very much indeed, and back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm conscious of time, so if we can handle each of the last two questions in 5 minutes, that would be great, please. Anatol.
Okay, well, really my subject's a continuation of the earlier question from Alison about help for specific sectors. James and Elspeth both pointed out that your sectors are much more important in Scotland, Wales than the UK as a trade with the EU. And you've also said, you've also welcomed the efforts from devolved governments for support that you've had. But is there more that these devolved governments can and should do for your sectors? Or are there risks that Brexit will make help actually more difficult to achieve from a devolved level, and that new trade deals and laws such as the Internal Market Act or the Subsidy Control Bill will create new legal obstacles for support for sectors in Scotland and Wales? Why don't we start with Dylan to talk about Wales and then hear from Scotland?
Yeah, well, as you say, you're right. It's difficult to know what impact maybe the UK Internal Market Bill could be able to have on that, and obviously the subsidy control regime as well. Just to keep it simple and short, I mean, I think in terms of financial assistance to the food and drink sector in Wales, further up the supply chain, obviously the support that we've had historically from EU financial assistance schemes has been vitally important to support the sector. You know, I think there is an issue going forward about, you know, what level of funding there will be available to the sector in future, and obviously, you know, how that will be delivered with regards to the Shared Prosperity Fund, and obviously there's some issues at the moment over whether that would be delivered through UK government or via Welsh government in Wales. Just regards with support, again, as I mentioned in the previous question, I think there is an opportunity now to pause and reflect on our general future agricultural policy in Wales on the basis of what we know now with regards to our trading environment and what we can do to underpin high quality food production. What else you can do? You know, regulatory regime, we probably wouldn't want to change that too much for the UK internal market situation, but also, we don't want to do anything that potentially impacts on our our export. And as we talked about already, we want to try and make sure there are no frictions. There's no friction between us and our EU markets.
Elspeth?
Thank you. I spoke a moment ago about some of the financial support that came to the seafood sector earlier this year when the industry was suffering just the immediate impacts of the changes in the trading conditions, and that funding was indeed very welcome and very helpful to businesses. But funding and support was coming from two directions. There was support from the UK government and there was support from the Scottish government, and it was very evident that that was not a joined up process. They were almost getting in each other's way and tripping each other up, and it was very difficult for businesses to actually know, well, what am I eligible for? What can I apply for? What should I do? So we were very clear with ministers at that time, governments, you must work together. It's very welcome that there's some assistance coming, but you've got to make it easy for businesses to access the support, and that would certainly be a plea going forward. We know that both governments will want to continue supporting businesses, but to do that well, then they need to be able to work together and not get in each other's way and not trip each other up. I think Dylan's already mentioned the replacement of EU funds, and I think at some of your earlier session, I heard some discussion about that. Clearly, we need to know from the UK government what their intention is for the replacement of the European Marine and Fisheries Fund. That was a very important source of support for the industry in terms of building infrastructure, undertaking research, a lot of the really important structural things that we need to invest in to build and sustain the industry going forward. We know there's only been a 1-year comprehensive spending review this year, so we only know what the situation is with the replacement for that fund until the end of March. So we certainly need to start to see some clarity from the UK government about what the intention is long term for the replacements of these funds and how businesses will be able to access them. I think the key issue for us in terms of that sort of devolved, reserved structure at the moment is just how the governments are going to work to make sure that the right decisions are made, that investment and support goes to where it is needed. And I think there was some discussion of that in your earlier session, and I think business would very much echo the points that were made then.
James, any final points about how devolved administrations can make their support for business work better?
So I think there's a huge amount of support that's there. I think the critical issue that's been touched on is how it now fits with UK government. And post-Brexit, it has kind of put an earthquake under the devolved settlement. Life was quite simple, actually, when we were in the European Union. Food and drink was devolved to Scotland and off we crack. And now suddenly decisions over trade policy, a UK government keen to get much more involved with businesses in our sector, makes it a more complex landscape. To be clear, businesses don't give a hoot who supports them. They just want the right support, but they really get frustrated when they start getting pulled in different directions. And there's been a lot of official engagement for UK government recently, very well-meaning, but confusing. So they've been encouraging SMEs in the food and drink industry in Scotland to engage with the National Food Strategy, the Dimbleby Strategy. Well, that's largely a strategy for England. It's relevant for Devolved, but it's largely a strategy for England. Scotland's had a food strategy for 10, 12 years. Wales has one. Northern Ireland wrote Going for Growth years ago. UK government is encouraging individual businesses to go get a trade advisor from DIT. Well, many of them have trade advisors already working through Scottish Development International. So we worked for a long time to align things in Scotland. UK government support is there for business across the UK, but it needs to be aligned, and there needs to be an understanding that a massive amount has been happening in devolved areas for a long time. If UK government wants to come to the party now, great, but they've got to take a breath and understand what's actually happening and being delivered, and understand how they add value to that, rather than potentially cause confusion on the ground, and because that is starting to happen, as well-meaning as it might be.
Thanks very much. Thank you all. And to the final question, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. We've already heard about the administrative costs and frictions, and there's been comment made about the impact assessment transparency. Given some of the remarks made, just to conclude, could you give us an idea how much the devolved governments have actually been involved in trade negotiations? And as a second, possibly looking forward, how should things be going forward for the devolved regions to be able to contribute on behalf of business? Elspeth, could you start there, please?
Yes, I can. I heard the end of the first session and I heard Ivan McKee speak with some frustration about the fact that the Scottish Government hadn't been sufficiently involved in trade negotiations. And that would certainly be my sense, looking at it from an outside perspective, that the devolved administrations have not been close to these. And there's perhaps an interesting parallel in my world when we have, and we have had for many, many years, annual fisheries negotiations. Now, until the UK left the EU, the UK took part in these fisheries negotiations as part of the EU delegation, and these negotiations with our neighbouring countries such as Norway and Faroe. The UK now takes part in these negotiations as an independent coastal state in its own right. Now, the UK government recognising that fisheries is critically important in Scotland, and we have 60% of the sector up here in terms of value and landings. The UK government and the Scottish government, I think, have always worked very collaboratively and really very well in those fisheries negotiations. And the Scottish government leads negotiators are part of the UK delegation and are very close to it. And there's perhaps a model there that governments might want to look at in terms of how you can engage the devolved administrations in what are essentially international negotiations.
Thank you. James, any particular opportunity to contribute and have a conversation on behalf of a business?
So again, I touched on the New Zealand model. They have trade delegations in own business and government together. It fosters a sense of collaboration, shared understanding and shared goals, whilst recognising that you can't win everything out of any negotiation. To your question to Elspeth, let's be blunt, the devolved nations are not involved in UK trade negotiations. They're not involved in discussions on UK trade policy, nor have they been made to feel in any way welcome in trying to get into those discussions. Now that has got to change. It absolutely has to change for the reason we've talked about. But particularly when you roll across the internal market bill with a UK trade policy, with an internal market bill with, again, a very laudable aim, let's get consistent business trading across the nations of the UK. But actually, the idea that one part of the UK could effectively impose its will on another rips the rug entirely from devolution. So we have to get structures in better place. There have been examples where it's worked before. I've seen it work. I'm old enough to remember foot and mouth 20 years ago. And the way UK Secretary of State at that point, I think Nick Brown, if my memory serves me right, used to work in coming to a settled will across the four nations, worked really, really smartly. He sat there as UK Secretary of State, attempting to get an agreement across the four nations. He pulled his junior minister in to represent England, so he wasn't conflicted by trying to come to a shared UK approach whilst also having to represent England. And he shared those discussions to try and come to some kind of agreement. The reality is the structures of devolution have never been able to get to grips with a shared public policy making process which reflects the needs of all four nations, and goodness knows we need it now. I'm positive that it can be achieved, but it requires probably some of the politics to be left at the door and a very pragmatic approach to be taken forward. The evidence so far makes me glum and gloomy about that. But the opportunities in terms of how we try and develop our export markets mean that we've got to try and make that work.
Thanks, James. That was very useful. And as a last word, Dylan.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to go back to how can businesses be involved, really. A couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to be involved in a trip with the British High Commission and the Ministry of Primary Industries in New Zealand to see how they operate in terms of trade deals and building new markets. And it was exactly as James said, government and industry work together as one in terms of developing and agreeing new trade deals to make sure that throughout the whole process, what's been negotiated is going to be there for the benefit of their industries, and that their industries will be able to access and to be able to operate in those markets as quickly as possible. So, prior to negotiations going ahead, there's discussions between both, and obviously industries even out there at the time of those negotiations. And I think that's what I'd like to see going forward, is that coordination and between government and industry to be able to open up these new markets, but working together to make sure that they'll benefit to us, rather than sometimes what we see at the moment is it seems to be a little bit lopsided, really.
Thank you, Dylan. Chair, back to you with the idea that we can do better.
No, exactly, absolutely. I think I come away, with a sense of optimism only in as much as there's plenty of good will out there. It's all a matter of better engagement, and I think that the interests of the government and the interests of industry and each of the devolved authorities are actually aligned if you take, a step back and look at the big picture. But I think I agree. I think that the politics often sort of hold us back on that. But on behalf of the Commission, I'd like to thank each of you. This has been a fantastic sort of insight that you've offered us. And on that note, I wish you a good afternoon and many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.